Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today as we examine a significant development that has emerged from the Eastern Pacific, one that carries profound implications for American military policy, international law, and the ongoing battle against narcotics trafficking in our hemisphere. Just recently, the United States military confirmed that it conducted an airstrike resulting in the deaths of 4 individuals aboard what has been described as a suspected drug boat in the Eastern Pacific waters. What makes this incident particularly noteworthy is that the operation was authorized at the highest levels of our defense establishment, reportedly ordered directly by the U.S. Defense Chief. This is not a routine interdiction. This represents a deliberate escalation in how America chooses to confront the drug trade at sea. Let me begin by contextualizing what we know and then explore the multiple dimensions of what this event means for the future. The Eastern Pacific has long served as a critical corridor for drug trafficking organizations moving cocaine from South American production centers, primarily Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, towards Central America and ultimately into the United States and other consumer markets. These maritime routes have proven stubbornly resistant to conventional interdiction methods. Drug traffickers have demonstrated remarkable adaptability, using semi-submersibles, fast boats, fishing vessels, and increasingly sophisticated concealment techniques to evade detection. The decision to employ lethal force from the air against what was identified as a drug vessel marks a distinct departure from standard operating procedures. Traditionally, counter-narcotics operations at sea have followed a model of interdiction, boarding, arrest, and seizure. Naval and Coast Guard vessels working alongside international partners would pursue suspected trafficking vessels, attempt to stop them, board when possible, detain the crew, confiscate the contraband, and process suspects through the criminal justice system. This new action suggests a different calculus, one where certain vessels may be treated not merely as criminal enterprises but as legitimate military targets. Now, let us consider the immediate justifications that defense officials might offer for such an operation. First, there is the argument of imminent threat. If intelligence suggested that this particular vessel posed some form of danger beyond simple drug trafficking, perhaps involvement with designated terrorist organizations or weapons smuggling alongside narcotics, military force could be legally justified under existing authorities. The blurring lines between drug trafficking organizations and insurgent or terrorist groups in Latin America have been documented for years. Organizations like the FARC dissidents in Colombia, certain Mexican cartels, and other groups have demonstrated willingness to engage in acts that go beyond traditional criminal activity. Second, officials may point to rules of engagement in international waters. If this vessel was operating in a manner that suggested hostile intent, refused to comply with lawful orders, or attempted to evade or resist interdiction in ways that endangered American or partner nation forces, the use of force could be deemed appropriate under maritime law and the inherent right of self-defense. Third, there is the consideration of operational necessity. If traditional interdiction methods were deemed too dangerous, too resource-intensive, or simply impractical given the specific circumstances, location, and capabilities of the target vessel, commanders might conclude that an airstrike represented the most effective means of preventing the cargo from reaching its destination. However, and this is crucial, we must also examine the serious concerns and potential ramifications that flow from this incident. The use of lethal military force against suspected criminals, even those engaged in transnational organized crime, raises profound legal and ethical questions. Under what specific authority was this strike conducted? Was it authorized under the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, which has been stretched to cover numerous counterterrorism operations? Was it conducted under counter-narcotics authorities granted to the Department of Defense? Or does this represent an expansion of presidential war powers into a new domain? The individuals killed in this strike were, as far as we know from the limited information available, suspected of drug trafficking. They were not captured, not tried, not afforded due process. Now, I recognize that in active combat zones or in situations involving imminent threats to life, the calculus changes. But the Eastern Pacific, while certainly a venue for illegal activity, is not traditionally considered a battlefield in the conventional sense. This action potentially establishes a precedent that drug traffickers at sea can be targeted for elimination rather than arrest. Let me explore what this means for international law and norms. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea establishes clear frameworks for how nations may act in international waters. While nations have the right to interdict vessels suspected of drug trafficking, particularly with the consent of the flag state, the use of lethal force is typically constrained to situations involving self-defense or imminent threat. If the United States is now applying a different standard, one that treats certain drug trafficking vessels as military targets subject to attack, other nations may feel entitled to adopt similar approaches. This could lead to a dangerous erosion of established maritime norms. Consider how adversarial nations might interpret or exploit this precedent. Russia, China, or other powers could point to American actions and justify their own use of military force against vessels they claim are involved in smuggling or other illicit activities. The potential for abuse is significant. What prevents a nation from labeling political dissidents fleeing by boat as smugglers and targeting them with military strikes? What stops authoritarian regimes from attacking vessels they claim are trafficking weapons or narcotics but which are actually engaged in humanitarian missions or supporting opposition groups? From a strategic perspective, we must ask whether this approach is effective or counterproductive in the broader war on drugs. The evidence from decades of counter-narcotics efforts suggests that supply-side interdiction, while politically popular, has limited impact on drug availability and prices in consumer markets. Traffickers are extraordinarily adaptive. For every vessel destroyed, trafficking organizations can simply deploy more boats. The profit margins in the drug trade are so enormous that losses are absorbed as a cost of doing business. If one route becomes too dangerous, traffickers shift to other routes, other methods, other corridors. What we may be witnessing is a tactical evolution without strategic reconsideration. Killing 4 suspected traffickers and destroying one boat does not meaningfully disrupt the multi-billion-dollar cocaine trade. It may generate headlines, demonstrate resolve, and satisfy political demands for tough action, but it is unlikely to reduce drug flows or impact prices on American streets. Meanwhile, it exposes the United States to legal challenges, moral criticism, and potential retaliation. Let us turn now to the domestic political dimension of this incident. In the United States, there is sustained pressure on government officials to demonstrate toughness on issues of border security, immigration, and drug trafficking. These issues have become deeply politicized and are often conflated in public discourse. An administration that can point to aggressive military action against drug traffickers may gain political capital with constituencies that prioritize these concerns. The optics of decisive military force can be compelling, even if the substantive impact is negligible. However, this political benefit comes with risks. Civil liberties organizations, international human rights groups, and some members of Congress will likely raise concerns about extrajudicial killings, lack of transparency, and potential violations of international law. There may be calls for investigations, for the release of more detailed information about the intelligence that justified the strike, about the rules of engagement that were applied, and about the chain of command that authorized the action. Furthermore, if details emerge suggesting that the intelligence was flawed, that the vessel was not actually carrying drugs, or that innocent individuals were killed, the political fallout could be severe. We have seen in other contexts how operations conducted with insufficient intelligence or inadequate verification can result in tragic errors. Remember that in the fog of maritime operations, with limited visibility and rapid decision-making timelines, mistakes are possible. Now let me address the implications for our relationships with Latin American partners. The United States conducts counter-narcotics operations in the Eastern Pacific, often in coordination with nations like Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, and others. These partnerships are built on frameworks of cooperation, intelligence sharing, and joint operations. How will partner nations respond to the United States unilaterally conducting lethal strikes in waters near their territory? Will they see this as a reassuring demonstration of American commitment, or will they view it as heavy-handed militarization that could spill over into their sovereign concerns? Some governments may welcome more aggressive American action, particularly those struggling with violence from trafficking organizations. Others may worry about sovereignty implications and the potential for collateral damage. If an American airstrike were to mistakenly target a fishing vessel from a partner nation, the diplomatic repercussions would be substantial. There is also the consideration of how this affects the overall security environment in the region. Latin America has experienced waves of violence connected to drug trafficking, but also a growing conversation about alternative approaches to drug policy, including decriminalization, harm reduction, and addressing the demand side of the equation. An American military strike that kills suspected traffickers may be seen by some as perpetuating a failed militarized approach rather than supporting more progressive, evidence-based strategies. Let us consider several scenarios for how this situation might develop in the coming weeks and months. In the first scenario, this incident remains an isolated event. The administration may have authorized this particular strike based on unique intelligence or circumstances that are not publicly disclosed. It represents a one-time departure from normal procedures rather than a new policy. In this case, we would expect to see counter-narcotics operations return to traditional interdiction methods, and this incident would fade from public attention after initial media coverage. In a second scenario, this strike represents the beginning of a new, more aggressive posture. We might see additional similar operations, perhaps even a formal announcement of a policy shift in how the United States approaches maritime drug trafficking. The Defense Department could establish new rules of engagement that permit lethal force against suspected drug vessels under certain conditions. This would likely be accompanied by public messaging emphasizing the threat posed by narcotics trafficking and the need for decisive action. Such a policy shift would almost certainly generate legal challenges, congressional oversight hearings, and international diplomatic friction. A third scenario involves escalation and retaliation. Drug trafficking organizations, particularly the most powerful cartels, have demonstrated capacity for violence and retaliation when they perceive their operations to be under threat. While they typically avoid direct confrontation with U.S. military forces, an aggressive new American posture could change their calculations. We might see trafficking organizations enhancing security on their maritime operations, potentially arming vessels, or even attempting to target American assets in retaliation. This could lead to an escalating cycle of violence in maritime zones that have traditionally seen criminal activity but not military-level conflict. A fourth scenario centers on legal and political pushback that constrains further action. If this incident generates sufficient controversy, if legal experts raise serious questions about its legitimacy, if allied nations express concern, or if evidence emerges suggesting problems with how the operation was conducted, the administration may pull back. There could be investigations, policy reviews, and a return to more traditional approaches. This scenario would demonstrate the continued power of institutional checks and balances, even in national security matters. Looking at the broader strategic picture, this incident invites us to reflect on the entire framework of how we think about drugs, crime, and military force. The war on drugs has been waged for more than 5 decades now. It has consumed enormous resources, resulted in mass incarceration, militarized police forces, destabilized regions, and enriched criminal organizations. Yet drugs remain widely available, addiction continues to devastate communities, and new synthetic substances create evolving challenges. Perhaps incidents like this airstrike should prompt us to ask more fundamental questions. Is military force truly an appropriate or effective tool against what is ultimately a public health and social problem? Are we addressing root causes, or are we simply engaging in an endless game of whack-a-mole with criminal enterprises that will always adapt and persist as long as demand exists? What would a genuinely strategic, evidence-based approach to drug policy look like, and how far is it from the path we are currently on? I want to be clear that I am not suggesting there is no role for law enforcement or interdiction in addressing drug trafficking. Criminal organizations that engage in violence, corruption, and exploitation should be held accountable. But accountability through the justice system, with due process and respect for human rights, is different from targeted killings at sea. We must be capable of distinguishing between policing and warfare, between criminals and enemy combatants. The men killed in this strike may well have been involved in drug trafficking. They may have been part of organizations responsible for tremendous harm. But they were also human beings who, under our legal system and international law, would typically be entitled to certain protections and procedures. The decision to end their lives from the air, apparently without any attempt at capture or arrest, should not be taken lightly or treated as routine. As this story develops, I encourage all of us to demand transparency from our government. What was the specific legal authority for this strike? What intelligence justified the action? What efforts were made to pursue alternatives to lethal force? What oversight mechanisms exist to ensure such operations are conducted lawfully and appropriately? These are not partisan questions. They are fundamental questions about the rule of law, the proper use of military power, and the values we claim to uphold. We should also pay attention to how this incident affects the individuals and communities most impacted by drug policy. Families in Latin America who lose loved ones to violence, whether from trafficking organizations or from counter-narcotics operations. Communities in the United States struggling with addiction and overdose deaths. The question we must always ask is whether our policies are making these situations better or worse. In closing, this airstrike in the Eastern Pacific is more than just a tactical military operation. It is a window into evolving security policies, changing norms around the use of force, and the ongoing challenge of how nations respond to transnational threats. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months about how this incident is explained, justified, and either repeated or reconsidered will have lasting implications. We stand at a moment where clarity is needed. The public deserves to understand under what circumstances their military may conduct lethal operations against suspected criminals. Our allies and partners deserve to know how American actions align with international law and shared values. And we all deserve a serious, evidence-based conversation about whether the strategies we have pursued for decades are actually working or whether we need the courage to imagine different approaches. Thank you for your attention to this critical matter. The path forward requires vigilance, demands accountability, and ultimately depends on our collective commitment to policies that are not just tough, but smart, not just decisive, but just. The 4 lives lost in the Eastern Pacific, whatever their involvement in illegal activity, should remind us that every use of lethal force carries weight, demands justification, and shapes the world we are creating. Let us ensure it is a world governed by law, guided by evidence, and committed to human dignity. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.